Jack often went to his father's house for dinners. These trips had become something of a ritual for him since Thomas married Claire, a woman a good decade younger. Usually, Jack went alone, staying for a few extra days, saying it was necessary to maintain a close bond with his father and adjust to his new family. But this time he suggested I join him. This would be my first meeting with his new stepmother. As much as I tried to stay neutral, I couldn't shake a few questions from my mind. Why did he always go alone? And what kept him here longer than planned? When we entered the house, Claire greeted us warmly, her smile bright, though something deeper flashed in her gaze when she saw Jack. She was clearly giving him special attention, holding her gaze a moment longer than necessary. It was a subtle gesture, but enough to plant the first seeds of unease within me. Throughout dinner, Claire acted as though she'd been the lady of the house for years, and to be honest, her confidence was striking. Her smile, her ease in conversation, and her poise all seemed to draw attention. She didn't hide her interest in Jack, and I noticed her hand briefly brush his as she spoke animatedly about something. This fleeting moment lingered in my mind, like a quiet warning. Jack seemed to feel her attention too, but rather than showing discomfort, he smiled back at her, as if there was already an unnamed connection between them. They exchanged quick glances, occasionally smirking at each other's words, as if they understood something only they shared. This exchange of looks and light smiles left me feeling slightly uneasy. As dinner came to an end, Claire suggested we stay for the week. She knew I was on vacation and Jack worked remotely, so there were no real obstacles. Her offer sounded friendly enough, but I hesitated before agreeing. Jack immediately supported the idea, assuring me it would be nice to spend some extra time here. And while it seemed like a good opportunity to relax, I couldn't shake a vague sense of worry. So we stayed for the week in Thomas and Claire's house, but now, knowing how she looked at Jack, I decided to keep my guard up. The unease I'd felt during dinner settled within me, like a premonition of something inevitable. I didn't know what exactly, but that woman, her attention toward my husband was too blatant to ignore. And though I wasn't ready to voice my suspicions to Jack, I resolved to observe, listening closely to every little thing. The first day of our week-long stay at Thomas and Claire's house started off calmly, but from the moment we arrived, I couldn't help but notice how warmly Jack's stepmother greeted us, particularly him. Her face lit up as if she had been eagerly waiting for him, her smile growing even brighter when he stepped into the room. This sudden enthusiasm struck me as overly cheerful, as if there was something more behind it. Soon I started noticing small details that made me feel uncomfortable. Almost immediately after breakfast, Claire found a reason for Jack to stay with her in the kitchen to help with the dishes, even though there was no real need. Normally, Thomas would handle these minor things himself, or ask one of the staff members who occasionally helped around the house. I went upstairs to unpack and settle in, but when I stepped out onto the landing sometime later, I could hear them chatting animatedly, their voices filled with an unexpected warmth and familiarity. This kept happening throughout the day. Claire constantly found excuses for Jack to help her around the house, fetching something from a high shelf, bringing up a bottle of wine from the cellar, even though she could easily have done these things herself. She seemed to bloom in his presence. Her smile never left her face, and her gestures became smooth and gentle, as if she were trying to impress him. Jack saw nothing unusual in this, laughing along with her and willingly fulfilling her requests. But I couldn't help but notice how easily they connected. In the evening, when the three of us gathered for dinner, Claire behaved even more freely than the night before. She told amusing stories from her youth, laughed, and occasionally winked at Jack, as if they shared something private, something only they could understand. And he responded in kind, smiling back, as though he was in on an unspoken joke between them. For a few moments, I felt like an outsider at that table, as if their world existed separately from mine. These glances and innocent winks began to trouble me more and more. Perhaps I was exaggerating, but every look between them seemed far too personal. Jack and Claire were so engrossed in conversation that at times it felt as if they forgot I was even there. At one point, I wanted to interrupt them and ask a question to break the atmosphere, but I held back, unwilling to reveal my suspicions. Yet something clicked within me. I knew these small details, like pieces of a puzzle, were forming something bigger, but I couldn't yet see what it was. After dinner, when Jack and I were alone in our room, I tried to bring up the topic calmly. We discussed general plans for the next few days, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him directly about what was bothering me. I was afraid of coming off as suspicious or jealous, but those small moments I witnessed during dinner refused to leave my mind. Claire's behavior was too open, and it seemed Jack was too easily drawn into her flirtation, even if unintentionally. I realized that if this continued, I would have to do something to keep myself from spiraling into doubt. The next morning, I decided to step out onto the terrace to enjoy some fresh air and the peaceful silence that felt so special here. Thomas's house was surrounded by greenery, and the garden seemed like the perfect place for a morning walk or a quiet cup of coffee. But as I approached the edge of the terrace, I saw something unexpected. Jack and Claire standing in the garden, much too close to each other. They were almost whispering, as if sharing a secret, their eyes focused entirely on each other. I felt a tightness in my chest. This scene seemed far too intimate for a casual conversation between a stepson and stepmother. The sense that I had caught them in something personal and forbidden gripped me, and I froze, unable to move or speak. Claire was the first to notice me. She quickly stepped back as if nothing had happened, as though the moment had been nothing more than a coincidence. But I felt I had glimpsed something more, as if there was an invisible connection between them that they were trying to hide from me. She smiled at me casually and walked back into the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Jack looked slightly uncomfortable but said nothing. He just brushed his hair back as if that could erase what I had just seen. That moment in the garden left me feeling anxious and puzzled. I didn't know how to explain what I felt, but everything inside me protested against what I had witnessed. I tried to maintain composure, hiding my suspicions, but the scene replayed in my mind all day. I kept returning to how they stood too close, speaking in hushed tones, unable to shake the feeling that something was going on between them. Attempting to talk to Jack about it, however, led nowhere. In the evening, when we were alone, I cautiously mentioned seeing them in the garden that morning and asked what they were talking about. Jack simply brushed it off as though it was nothing. He assured me there was nothing unusual, saying that Claire had just asked him for help deciding where to plant a new bush. But his indifferent tone and the faint irritation at my curiosity only deepened my doubts. He acted like everything was fine, but I could sense he was hiding something. This distance between us was growing, and I felt increasingly like a stranger in this house, among people who were keeping something from me. I decided not to press him further, but I knew my suspicions wouldn't just go away. That chance scene in the garden had signaled to me that something unpleasant and inevitable lay ahead, and I could no longer hold back the wave of doubts building within me. Days passed, and I noticed Claire increasingly directing her attention toward Jack, especially when she thought no one was watching. These were fleeting moments, barely perceptible gestures, but they began to form a picture I could no longer ignore. Her fingers would lightly touch his hand as she spoke, or she would casually adjust her hair while looking at him. Each time their eyes met, it felt like they lingered a moment longer than what was acceptable between family. At first, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking, that it was all in my head. But every day brought new observations that confirmed my unease. I started trying to stay close to them, to watch, but it wasn't easy. It seemed they always found a way to be alone, as if they were secretly arranging it. One day changed everything. I returned to the house a little earlier than planned, and as I entered, I heard voices coming from the study. Approaching quietly, I realized it was Jack and Claire. I hadn't expected to find them together, and it made me pause at the doorway. Through the slightly open door, I saw Claire sitting far too close to him, their heads bent together, speaking in near whispers. For a moment, I felt as if I were seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. When they noticed me, Claire quickly pulled back as if she'd been caught off guard. Her face tightened, and she looked away for a moment, as though hiding something important. Jack looked a bit flustered too, but tried to maintain composure, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. They exchanged a glance that I caught just before he stood up and stepped toward me. "You're back already?" he asked, attempting a smile. But there was something in his eyes I couldn't decipher. I nodded, trying not to reveal my tension, and told him I had simply forgotten something in the house. All the while, Claire remained silent, her face showing a strange mix of embarrassment and worry. As I left the study, I realized that this moment might be the key to understanding what was happening behind my back. It felt like I was on the brink of comprehension, yet still without concrete proof. Doubts gnawed at me. Maybe it was just friendship or mutual respect. But my intuition told me there was something more. Something in their behavior was too personal, too intimate, and I couldn't shake the feeling. Now, every time I saw them together, my suspicion grew stronger. I couldn't rid myself of the thought that something serious was unfolding behind my back, that I was becoming an unwilling witness to a budding connection between Jack and Claire. But without proof, I couldn't confront them openly. All I could do was wait and watch, hoping that sooner or later I would find the truth. Each day spent in this house felt like adding a drop of poison to my mind. Jack began to act differently, almost imperceptibly, but no less troubling for it. He started to seek privacy, stepping out of the room to take calls, which wasn't his usual behavior. Sometimes he would be gone for long periods, citing work or meeting friends. But each time, these excuses sounded less and less convincing. It was as if he was trying to hide from me, as though his world had split in two, one part for me, and another for something that remained beyond my sight. One evening, I caught a faint scent on his clothes, something familiar yet foreign to me. It was a subtle, almost sweet fragrance with hints of jasmine. Anxiety rose within me. Where could he have picked it up? Hardly at work or with friends. A name surfaced in my thoughts. Claire. But I tried to push the thought away, deciding not to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was just imagining things. Yet that very evening, my doubts surged back with renewed intensity. While the three of us sat in the living room, Claire walked over and casually sat down on the sofa next to Jack. A second ago, he had been looking at me, but as soon as Claire sat beside him, his attention shifted to her. I expected him to pull away, but he didn't. He allowed her to sit close, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She was saying something quietly to him, and he leaned in slightly to listen. I didn't want to believe he was so easily drawn into her influence, but the fact remained. He made no effort to distance himself. That moment was a turning point for me. I could no longer silently watch as Claire, slowly yet deliberately, drew closer to my husband. This went beyond innocent looks and fleeting touches. I realized she was indeed trying to seduce him, and her confidence that I wouldn't interfere only strengthened my resolve. That night, when we were finally alone, I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I confronted Jack, trying to stay calm, even though I was boiling with emotions. I tried to voice my concerns, hinting at his frequent disappearances and the fact that he often stayed alone with Claire. Jack, however, brushed it off, assuring me that it was all in my head. His voice was calm, but I could feel the tension beneath his calm facade, as if he was hiding something. After our conversation, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. My patience had run out. If Claire truly had her sights set on my husband, then I had to make it clear to her that I wouldn't stand by idly. There were still a few days left, and I resolved not to let either of them hide behind empty smiles and meaningless words. I knew I had to act, and the sooner I did, the better for me and for the preservation of our family. Doubt had begun to consume me, like a shadow closing in from all sides. I could no longer ignore the small details, the gestures, the glances, and my recent conversation with Jack. But I still lacked real proof. Part of me clung to the hope that perhaps my suspicions were nothing more than imagination. Yet deep down, I knew I had to do something. One evening, while Jack was in the shower, I went into the kitchen and noticed his phone left on the counter. My heart raced. I had never considered myself the type to do this, but at that moment, doubt was eating me alive. That phone, just within reach, seemed to beckon me. In the end, my inner struggle ended, and I gave in. With trembling hands, I unlocked the phone and opened his messages. Scrolling through countless conversations, I stumbled upon one with Claire. From the very first lines, I felt a surge of anger building inside me. Her words to Jack were filled with flirtation and coy phrases. Her messages, seemingly innocent at first glance, actually spoke of something much deeper, a connection they had carefully concealed. The further I read, the stronger my sense of betrayal grew. Claire had written to Jack, inviting him over while I was out at a meeting and Thomas was at work. Her messages were full of innuendo, hints that might seem playful if it hadn't been a conversation between a stepmother and stepson. But it got worse. In one of the messages, she sent him a photo, posing in her room with a slight smile, her gaze holding something that made my chest go cold. The image, straddling the line of decency, was never meant for my husband. It was a step beyond, showing me all I needed to know. I felt the ground drop out from beneath me. Every part of me screamed, rage, humiliation, pain. But behind this storm of emotions came a hollow emptiness, heavy and deep, like a void within that couldn't be filled. How could he do this? How could he betray our family, deceive my trust? Claire, this woman who pretended to be friendly and welcoming, had deliberately led things here. But instead of causing a scene, I realized I needed to act more coldly. My first thought was to burst into the bathroom and confront Jack right then. But then I understood that wouldn't bring me any real satisfaction. I wanted them both to feel the same pain I was feeling. The agony of knowing their betrayal was exposed. Placing his phone back on the counter, I felt a cold calm wash over me. I had a plan. I decided to wait for the right moment to turn their betrayal against them. Maybe Claire thought I wouldn't notice, that I was too naive to understand. But now I was ready to make my move. Her game was over, and I was going to make sure they both paid for every second of this deceit. The next day, I suggested to Jack that we stay a bit longer. I told him how much I enjoyed being at his father's and Claire's house, how this peaceful, cozy atmosphere was exactly what I needed right now. To my surprise, he readily agreed. I caught a glint in his eye that seemed strange, as if he was glad to stay for Claire's sake. It was as though the chance to spend more time around his young stepmother intrigued him more than he wanted to show. And this only strengthened my resolve. While Jack relished the extra time to be around Claire, I was already crafting my own plan for revenge. He needed to feel the same pain I had felt. Their secret glances and conversations could no longer go unpunished. I intended to use this additional week to teach them a lesson. And for that, I decided to turn my attention to Thomas. Thomas had always been attentive and kind to me, his warmth seemingly genuine. Unlike Claire, he always showed respect and sincerity in his interactions, and his interest in our family was unmistakable. Perhaps he, too, felt isolated in this house, in a marriage with a woman who hardly shared his values or interests. I knew I could use his loneliness to my advantage. I began seeking opportunities to spend more time with him. At first, it appeared perfectly natural. I simply kept our conversations going, finding topics that interested him, showing that I valued his perspective. We talked about life, work, family, and he gradually started to open up to me. I could sense he needed someone to listen and understand him, and this made him vulnerable. Every day, I became more certain that Thomas wasn't indifferent to me. He started seeking my company, finding reasons to linger, wanting to discuss something he felt was important. I could see he felt comfortable in my presence, and that was exactly what I needed. He began to trust me, and I felt my plan taking shape. I was ready to use his loneliness and disappointment in his marriage to show Jack and Claire that their game wasn't the only one being played in this house. Seducing Thomas was becoming an act of justice. Jack needed to understand that betrayal always comes back around. If he thought he could treat me like a toy and betray our trust, then now he would see that I could make a move of my own. And in this situation, I was fully determined to go all the way. Now, I had a week to show them that their betrayal wouldn't go unnoticed. Thomas trusted me, and I was ready to use that trust to shatter the illusion they were living in. The plan for revenge that was gradually taking shape in my mind became my way to restore the balance they had destroyed. They both needed to feel the full weight of my intentions, and I was prepared to see this through to the end. From that day on, I began to act. Carefully choosing every word, every glance, I started to draw closer to Thomas, slowly but surely. My entire appearance was now meticulously crafted. I selected clothing that highlighted my femininity, soft fabrics, gentle colors, a slightly open neckline, or a subtle hint of shape. These were details noticeable but not overt, refined enough to catch his attention and spark subtle interest. I noticed how his gaze lingered a moment longer, how his eyes traveled over my image. I found excuses to be alone with him, avoiding any sense of intrusiveness. We discussed topics that seemed to captivate us both: travel, books, family. Gradually, our conversations grew more personal. I allowed myself to lightly touch his hand when he spoke about his dreams and disappointments, pretending I simply understood, that I was there to support him. He needed warmth, someone to share his inner feelings with, and I became that person. Between us, something unique began to form, a silent thread of attraction that he, too, seemed to notice. I could see his gaze soften, hear his voice lower when he spoke to me, sense him unconsciously leaning closer, as if he, too, felt this pull. He knew these feelings went against his duty, yet he couldn't resist my charm. I understood that my plan was working. I watched as his internal barriers gradually crumbled, as he became more vulnerable around me. With each passing day, his emotional attachment to me grew, and along with it, my sense of power. This was more than mere revenge. I felt myself regaining strength and control over the situation, seeing how Thomas succumbed to my efforts. One evening, during a walk in the garden, I allowed myself to take a bolder step. I paused, letting our gaze hold a little longer than appropriate. In that moment, everything stilled, our gazes, the subtle motion of hands. He took a step closer but stopped, as though something held him back. Yet from his look, from the way he tried to hide his feelings, I knew that I had complete control over the situation now. In that brief moment, I felt victorious. I had achieved what I wanted, and I knew now that neither Jack nor Claire could easily overlook me. This was my game, and I relished each step towards its culmination. The feeling of power I gained fueled me, and now I wanted to go all the way, watching as their worlds began to crumble. When Jack and Claire announced they were going out to get groceries, I felt a surge of anticipation inside. This rare chance to be alone with Thomas meant I could take the next step, yielding to that quiet but growing spark between us. As soon as the door closed behind them, the silence of the house took on a special quality, filled with expectation, with the feeling that something inevitable lay ahead. Thomas and I sat in the living room, and I noticed that despite his attempt to appear casual, he seemed slightly tense. Our gazes met again, and in that moment I knew there were no more barriers between us. I stood up and, without breaking eye contact, took a short but deliberate step toward him. My plan was moving toward its climax, and I was ready to take the risk. I leaned in, and as my lips met his, true passion flared between us. Thomas pulled back for a second, his expression conflicted, a struggle between duty and temptation. "Emily, this is wrong," he whispered, but I could see how hard it was for him to resist his feelings. My kiss was both forbidden and alluring to him. I felt him give in, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me closer. Everything else disappeared. There was only us and this moment where desire had become undeniable. His breathing quickened, and my arms wrapped around him instinctively, letting myself enjoy his closeness, knowing he was now completely under my spell. This was more than just passion. It was a feeling of power I had never experienced before. At that moment, we heard the front door slam. Jack and Claire had returned, their footsteps echoing through the house. I quickly pulled away, feeling a surge of triumph within me. I met Thomas's gaze, seeing on his face a mix of confusion and the same desire that had overtaken him just moments before. I winked at him, as if to assure him this was only the beginning, and then headed to my room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of what had just happened. Back in my room, I felt my confidence grow stronger. This step was more than just a victory. It was the first proof that my revenge was becoming real. Now I knew that Jack would suffer just as I had, that his own actions would turn against him. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, feeling a surge of determination. I was no longer just planning revenge, I was living it, and my next goal was clear, to see it through to the end, to spend a passionate night with Thomas. That would be the point of no return. My resolve grew only stronger, and I knew that this time I wouldn't allow myself to stop until I achieved everything I had set out to do. The next day, gathering my thoughts and casting aside my last doubts, I knew the time had come to finalize my plan. My resolve was stronger than ever. This would be my night, the night that would leave Jack with an unforgettable wound, one that would ache as deeply as mine. I had decided to record everything that happened and make it the final, most destructive act of my revenge. Thomas and I were alone late that evening when the entire house had settled into silence. I knew he wouldn't resist, that his feelings for me had long since crossed the line. We were together, and I allowed myself to succumb to the passion, fully immersing in the moment, letting my emotions flare, ensuring that every gesture, every glance was etched into memory. I set up my phone to capture our night so that Jack would have no doubt about the betrayal he would soon see with his own eyes. This night became the culmination of all the pain, all the doubts and fears I had carried through these weeks. I saw how Thomas looked at me with such desire and tenderness, and despite the part of me that felt a real attachment to him, my goal remained clear. This was not only proof of my revenge, but the ultimate destruction of whatever bond Jack and his father still shared. When the night ended and Thomas drifted off to sleep, I quietly gathered my things, careful not to disturb him. I packed my belongings silently, as though leaving behind not just this house but all the memories tied to it. My plan was complete, and now only the final step remained. When everyone had gone to bed, I left the house in the quiet of the night, feeling a strange sense of relief. Under the cold light of the moon, I paused by the door and sent the video to Jack. I knew it would destroy him, but this was the price he had to pay for his betrayal. This video was meant to be the same knife in his back that he had driven into mine, hiding his affair with Claire. The next morning, everything changed. I couldn't see Jack's reaction, but I imagined his world collapsing as he watched the video, realizing his own actions had led to this. The consequences this video would bring upon the entire family were already irreversible, and I knew that after this night, I could never return to my previous life. My decision had not only broken him, but had shattered me as well, and now, as I walked away into the night, I realized that my revenge, though fulfilled, had left an emptiness I would carry alone. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was flooded with messages. One after another, short but furious words from Jack flashed across the screen like lightning, tearing apart the remnants of our marriage. He was furious. His anger seeped through every message. He couldn't believe what he had seen on the video, that his own wife had cheated on him with his father. It didn't take long for him to reach his breaking point. I could feel his world collapsing right in front of me. He wrote that he immediately confronted Thomas, unleashing everything he had bottled up inside. Their argument was intense. Each word, each accusation reflected the agony of betrayal. Jack blamed his father for destroying their family, for betraying his trust, for turning their relationship to ashes. I could imagine them standing face to face, each of them realizing the depth of the chasm now between them. I didn't respond to his messages right away, reading them one by one, feeling my revenge materialize in these furious words. Finally, when his anger seemed to subside, I replied briefly and coldly, "I knew about your affair with Claire." No response followed. On the other end, silence, but within that silence lay the truth. Jack couldn't argue, and his silence became my confirmation that my suspicions had been justified. He didn't reply, but his silence said it all, admitting that something indeed had been going on between him and his stepmother. All those nights he stayed in her room, their secret meetings, it all became clear. A short while later, I received a message from Thomas. His words were filled with desperation, each phrase shouting his pain and confusion. "Why did you do it, Emily? Why did you use me?" he asked, as if trying to understand something that had become a crushing blow for him. Thomas couldn't comprehend why I had led him to this edge, why I had destroyed everything that had developed between us. He wanted to believe that his feelings had been genuine, but now everything he knew had crumbled. I didn't reply to him. A part of me still felt pity for Thomas, and I didn't want to destroy him entirely by revealing the whole truth. He didn't need to know that his own son had been involved, that Jack had been carrying on an affair with his wife behind his back. Let him believe it was only revenge against Jack, that my feelings had been driven solely by a desire to retaliate. He didn't need to know the depth of the pain I had endured and the ugliness hidden within this house. Now it was all over. My revenge had reached its goal, but its consequences were far more devastating than I could have anticipated. Jack, Thomas, Claire, their worlds were shattered, and I was left standing amidst the ruins, realizing that my victory had left only ashes. My heart felt empty, and I understood that with this family I had also destroyed a part of myself. When it was all over, I was left alone, surrounded by an emptiness that felt insurmountable. My revenge, the meticulously planned scheme I had nurtured and carried out, had suddenly turned against me. Those brief moments of satisfaction now felt like pale shadows, stripped of all meaning. In their place was a void, deep and unending. Now, with every thread of my life severed, I finally understood the magnitude of the destruction I had wrought, not only on Jack, but on everyone else. I had destroyed not just our marriage, but an entire family, leaving only fragments behind. Thomas and Jack, father and son, would never be able to look each other in the eyes without pain and anger. Claire perhaps had also realized the consequences of her flirtation, though she might have seen it only as a harmless game. I returned home to the place that had once been our shared space, but now it was only a reminder of everything we'd lost. No triumph, no victory, only silence and the realization that I had torn apart everything I once held dear. Within these walls, there was nothing left that resembled the happiness we had once shared, only cold, empty rooms that now echoed with my own thoughts. I often wondered if my revenge had been justified. Yes, Jack had betrayed me, deceived me, and failed to honor my trust. But was it worth it? Was it worth shattering the lives of all these people for a few moments of satisfaction? I knew the answer, and it hurt. My sense of justice, which had once seemed so essential, was now nothing more than a bitter reminder of how far I had gone in my quest to reclaim my dignity. Sitting alone in the darkness, I felt remorse creeping in. I had thought I could bear the weight of my actions, that I could justify what I had done. But it turned out that this was just an illusion. That destroying others' lives even after betrayal brought neither peace nor satisfaction. Instead, I was left with a burden that I would now carry alone. Every detail, every look, every touch, now all of it was just part of a past I had turned to ruins. I thought my revenge would bring me freedom, that I could leave everything behind and live knowing the truth had been revealed. But I was wrong. In the end, I had become the sole victim of this war, paying a far higher price for revenge than I had ever imagined. A month had passed since I left Thomas's house, leaving behind only the ruins of the family I was once a part of. I tried to forget everything that had happened, to find solace in solitude, but the past clung to me like a shadow. The messages from Thomas had stopped coming after the first week, but every time I looked at my phone, I still felt a lingering expectation, like a part of me needed to close this chapter, to put an end to it all. And so, after a month, I finally gathered the courage to respond to him. I knew he needed an explanation, that he deserved some semblance of forgiveness. If not from me, then from himself. As I typed out my message, I read his words again, full of pain and questions. He wanted to understand why I had done this, why I had chosen a path that destroyed their family and left only emptiness in its wake. "Thomas," I began, "I'm sorry. I truly am sorry that I destroyed your family. But at that moment, I felt like I had no other choice. Your son didn't care that I was suffering, that I had been betrayed, and the only way I could ease my own pain was through revenge. I'm sorry that I dragged you into this, and I'm sorry that it caused you pain too." After sending the message, I felt a small sense of release, a space opening up inside me for forgiveness, not from him, but from myself. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't mend the relationships I had shattered, but I could at least acknowledge my guilt to Thomas. I truly regretted that things had ended this way, that I had left behind people who became entangled in this complicated and tragic story. There was no reply from Thomas, and I knew perhaps that this was for the best. Several months had passed since I left my ruined life behind and stepped into the unknown. I tried to start fresh, in a place where no one knew about me, my past, or the pain that had become a part of my life. Solitude turned out to be both a challenge and a blessing. I searched for inner peace, slowly letting go of thoughts of revenge, betrayal, and everything that had once bound me to Jack and Thomas. The past became a faint echo, memories resurfacing less frequently and with diminishing pain each time. But despite this, I knew that the experience I had gone through had forever changed me. I could no longer see trust and closeness the way I once had. Every new encounter, every new relationship now held a hidden caution. A part of me always prepared for the possibility that betrayal could come even from those I considered close. My experience had taught me that even the closest people could become a source of betrayal. I realized that I could no longer blindly trust in the stability of relationships, could no longer ignore signals, and could no longer allow myself to become a victim again. The fear of betrayal, which had once been only a shadow, was now a constant companion, and I had to learn to live with it. I started a new life, rebuilding my world, but this time with a deeper understanding of what people are capable of. I sought inner peace, but I also knew I had to be strong and cautious. I was learning to trust myself, my instincts, and my choices, avoiding the illusions that had led me to destruction in the past. The past would remain a part of me, but now it was only a quiet echo that no longer dictated my actions. This experience had changed me, leaving a mark that could never be erased. I accepted it as part of my new life and moved forward, striving to find the peace and independence I had always lacked.